Okay, hi, I'm Ulrike Hahn from Birkbeck Center for Cognition, Computation and Modeling. Thanks for joining us at this month's seminar series on tech and democracy, which concerns itself with all things in the intersection between stuff computational and contemporary threats to democracy. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Ceren Budak, who's an assistant professor of information and electrical engineering at the University of Michigan, where she does computational social science, in particular using large-scale data sets and computational techniques to study problems with policy, social, and political implications. One of the things she's been doing is studying anonymous Facebook data on sharing of online content. And I sort of hope that there will be some of this in this talk, but I don't know for sure. But she will be speaking to us about political misinformation during the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections. The talk will be about 30 minutes, and then after that, there will be a panel discussion with our panelists, Steve Lewandowski, Mohsen Mosleh, and Kai-Cheng Yan, who Jason will introduce briefly next before we cut to the talk. So, thank you.
Yes, so as Ulrike said, we have three panelists with us in addition to the speaker who are well positioned to comment on the work being presented. So today we have Steve Lewandowski, a professor of cognitive science at the University of Bristol, Mohsen Mosleh, a lecturer at the University of Exeter Business School, and Kai-Cheng Yang, a PhD candidate in informatics at Indiana University. And so with that, I'll just invite Ceren to share her screen and we'll get started.
All right, 1 second. Thank you very much, Ulrike and Jason, for a great introduction, and thank you for having me here. Very excited to be here. So this talk is going to be about a tale of two elections, so the US presidential elections in 2016 and 20 in the US. And I use tale intentionally because this is actually going to be a sort of a storytelling using big data coming from heterogeneous sources of data. So this is going to be one of the most more descriptive, actually, talks that I have sort of given. But I do think that following up elections with understanding what happened is a useful kind of use of our time, hopefully. So that's what I will be trying to do here. And with that, political misinformation was clearly an important concern, a top of mind following the 2016 election in the US, where it was a surprise, and leading up to the 2020 election and following it as well. So this is setting the stage for these stories that I'm going to be telling you. And I will start and focus most of my time on the 2016 election, where we had more time to do our analyses. And I'm going to be focusing on the prevalence of fake news producer content on Twitter. So sorry, Ulrike, this is not going to be about Facebook. That work is hopefully about to be submitted somewhere, but it's not ready yet. So Twitter only this time, and we're going to be looking at prevalence and also examine how it changes over time. Then I'm going to be focusing on the agenda setting priorities of these two different types of publishers, traditional and fake news publishers. And to me, most interestingly, being able to connect it to the kinds of things that the electorate was sort of remembering about the candidates. We're going to be looking at the alignment between the information that individuals retained about the two candidates and the agendas of these two types of publishers. And just as a note, most of the work I'm going to be sharing here is going to be from my 2019 paper at www. But also there are some aspects of this talk that relates to the broader project that led to a book called Words That Matter that was published this year with my collaborators Letitia Bode, Jonathan Ladd, Frank Newport, Josh Basic, Lisa Singh, Stuart Soroka, and Mike Drogat, where we were looking more broadly at how the news and social media reacted to the candidates, what kind of information news producers produced and put out there, and what eventually was kind of received by the news consumers. So, so this is going to be a big a chunk of what we'll talk about, and this collaboration is, this book is a collaboration between University of Michigan, Georgetown, and Gallup. And then the last part of the talk, we're going to be moving on to 2020, which just happened. So it's going to be quite a fresh data that I'm going to be presenting here. And here I am only going to focus on the alignment between what the information individuals retain about the new well, one of them is new two candidates at this time, and the agendas of these fake and traditional news outlets. And this work is, why is it not there? This is a project called, so this is part of a broader work, the Breakthrough Project, the same research team coming from Georgetown and University of Michigan, but this time collaborating with CNN and SSRS. SSRS was basically running the interview studies, and we were collaborating with CNN to share some of the findings on a weekly basis through articles that CNN was publishing. So that's kind of, that's my goal for this talk. So with that said, I'm kind of going back to the first part, which is 2016, where again, the goal is to go through these three stories, which is understanding the prevalence, understanding the focus, agenda setting priorities of these publishers, and this alignment question. But before I do that, let me put out there what I define in this set of studies as the type of political misinformation that is of interest. Their political misinformation is produced and spread in various different ways. Here we're going to be focusing on a particular version, which is going to be basically focusing on the publishers themselves. So I'm basically, this work is grounded in scholarship that suggests, coming from a 2018 science paper, that suggests that it's important to focus on the publishers as opposed to individual stories, since this gets at this defining element of fake news, which is the intent and processes of publishers. So with that said, there are various lists that are out there that scholars and reputable news organizations have shared that I could have used in my work. The one that I'm going to be presenting here is the one that relies on the list that was shared by Alcott and Jenskow, mostly because it was the most comprehensive one, and it's the one where the authors have some robustness checks in terms of the qualities of the list. And in terms of for the traditional news publishers, there are again various ontologies that are out there that will give you a list of domains, web domains that correspond to news producers. Here we're relying on Alexa, which is a kind of a subsidiary of Amazon. That's again gives us an ontology of the web, and we're using the news category to identify news producers more generally. I do want to point out that we do have a follow-up study that examines the robustness of the findings of what I'm going to present now, as well as more broader robustness findings of questions that relate to political misinformation. I'm happy to talk about those and offline, maybe during the perhaps during the panel part. And I'll also point out, whenever the results that I'm going to present are depending on the list of choice, I will point it out so that you know, that part is clear. Okay, so now having defined how we're going to be looking for a traditional and a kind of fake news producer content, let's think about some other data that we're going to be using here. Another form of data that I was using in my paper was coming from social media. I guess a very common question that researchers ask is the degree to which information coming from fake versus traditional news publishers spread on social media. So to answer this question, I'm using a daily random sample of tweets that mention Trump and Clinton, and basically looking into these tweets to identify the ones that actually have a URL so that we can tie it to the publisher information. So basically I scrape these corresponding pages, And you're already seeing one level of difference between the kind of conversations that were happening about the two candidates. You see a lot more sharing of kind of references to external content, URLs, when people are talking about Clinton versus when people are talking about Trump. It's just kind of more like free text as opposed to links to articles. So that's data that we're going to be using to understand this prevalence of this type of content on social media. The more interesting data for me for this project was, perhaps maybe because we always have access to social media data, it was this Gallup data. So we, again, as part of the book project, we're collaborating with Gallup. Gallup has an extensive daily survey. They added 2 open-ended questions for us to their daily survey leading up to the election, starting from a week before RNC and DNC. They were asking respondents, what have you recently read, seen, or heard about Trump and Clinton asked separately in random order? And their responses were basically recorded verbatim. So that allows us to move beyond just looking at social media users, but really tie this fake versus traditional news content to what is top of mind for the electorate. So, those are the data that I'm going to be using for telling the stories that I'm going to be telling you for the rest of this talk. So, starting with the first question about prevalence, this was again at the time when I was doing this analysis. The kinds of things that were out there were these articles that were suggesting that fake news content was outperforming real news, or had outperformed real news in the 2016 campaign. There were various not scholarly articles, but news articles that were suggesting such a pattern. And what I have found is that there is some truth to this. So in that, if you look at take a random article, take a random kind of fake news versus traditional news article, you would see that they were actually comparable in terms of the number of shares they got and number of days for which they were shared. So that's concerning, right? Because we expect that these traditional news producers employ, journalists that have journalistic standards. They know how to write, and the fact that they had comparable kind of popularity to these low-quality news producers is quite a big concern. But what we also find is that there is a silver lining in that due to the larger production of traditional news outlets, so imagine New York Times and Fox News and Wall Street Journals of the world, the overall prevalence of traditional news still outperformed fake news publishers in this particular case, 1 to 4. I will point out this is one result that was actually not robust to the list that we list of fake news versus traditional news you would pick to study these kinds of questions. The overall prevalence of fake news was something between 3% to 40%, depending on which list you use. And that to me is at least suggesting why there are some disagreements in scholarship and the prevalence of fake news as well. So it's quite important to do these robustness checks to make sure that your findings are robust. But again, like even we're the middle of the road, like 20% is a bad number. It doesn't mean that they were outperforming, but it's still a non-negligible number if we go with the list that we're using, which is produced by Alcott and Jenscow. So given that there seems to be a non-negligible number of content out there, it's perhaps worthwhile thinking about how it changed over time, which is what I'm going to be showing in this next plot here. So here we're looking at the time window between June, again, this is sort of RNC and DNC time, to right after the election. We're looking at patterns of prevalence of fake news, separately for content that was shared about Clinton, which is this blue line, and Trump, which is the red line. And we're just as a reference point, adding here this green line, which is coming from the Gallup surveys again. So this is a sort of national representative sample of the US population and how they feel about Clinton compared to how they feel about Trump. So, I know it has been a long time, and I'm coming from a US perspective. This is sort of a more UK perspective. So this doesn't mean that the Clinton was favorable. It just means that Clinton was more favorable. So you can see that all these values are greater than 0. So it's saying that she was more favorable this entire time according to our surveys. And we can talk about the problems with these surveys this entire time, right? So so what we're seeing here is there are a couple of patterns. One is that you're seeing an increasing prevalence of this fake news producer content over time, and especially for Clinton. If sort of usually this emerges, but the statistics also show that there is a high correlation between fake news prevalence and Clinton lead in favorability. What is perhaps more interesting is that if you do cross-correlation analysis, you see that the changes in favorability leads changes in fake news prevalence. So that doesn't mean leads to, right? This is correlation, this is not causation, but it suggests that the correlation is highest with 4-day lag being 0.85, which is a really high correlation measure. So this doesn't, to the degree that there could be a causal story here, this doesn't suggest that fake news changes favorability numbers, that it responds to changes in favorability numbers. So this could be that perhaps as Clinton is becoming more favorable, the numbers, the kind of the production increases, or maybe the use of bots to try to circumvent that kind of increases. Or people change their kind of consumption patterns, or it could be that both of these measures are responding to a third variable. But it is undeniable the degree to which the fake news production and consumption was aligned with the election dynamics leading up to this 2016 election. So that's besides the causation kind of question, the strength of correlation is quite significant. So now I'll change gears and tell this other part of this story, which is this agenda setting functions of these news producers. So agenda setting is a very important subtopic in political communication. The broad idea is that news media are not very good at telling us how to think about things, but they're very good at telling us what to think about. So they set the agenda by kind of covering topics more or less frequently, suggesting sort of more or less importance that should be attached to each topic. So the goal here is to understand these similarities and differences between these producers. And I won't go into the details of the methodology too much, but it is basically a semi-supervised learning approach where we start with using LDA to identify candidate topics and topic word pairs, but those tend to be quite noisy. Then we use expert manual labeling to map those to a smaller set of coherent topics and seed words, which we use then to, through guided LDA to kind of clean it up and have a better topic assignments. And finally, basically, we evaluate these topics using crowdsourcing platforms and identify that basically 15 out of 19 topics had a good kind of F1 kind of accuracy scores, which we then use to examine similarities and differences. And the topics sort of would make sense in that there are some policy-related topics like climate, abortion, economy, and so forth. And there are a ton that are kind of scandal-focused, which is sex scandals and candidate health and emails and so forth. And we also have obviously the horse race topic, which is election. So what do we observe here? So here I'm basically showing you the emphasis that the two types of publishers were putting on these different topics. on this y-axis, the higher you are on the y-axis, the more central that topic is to traditional news compared to fake news. And the lower you are, it's more central to fake news compared to traditional news. Looking at this, and on the x-axis we have the overall coverage, which is what percent of that content of that type of publisher was going to this particular kind of topic. So if we start with these differences, first thing is that we see the election topic, the horse race topic, is a lot more central to traditional news coverage, which is not as surprising. Again, there's a lot of political communication literature, kind of scholarship that shows that this is actually mostly driven by demand. People just like reading, election coverage. So the focus on this by traditional news is not surprising. Perhaps the lower focus by kind of fake news producers might be more so. If you're looking at here, I'm highlighting topics that were more policy oriented, and the more policy oriented topics are sort of higher on this y-axis, so they're more central to traditional news compared to fake news. While for fake news, now highlighting in red, scandals were perhaps unsurprisingly more central to fake news coverage. What is important to note, however, is the actual similarities. So even though, yes, policy coverage is more central to traditional news, the percent differences are actually quite small. And that actually ties back to the second point, which is that if you go back to the scandals, again, they're more central to fake news, but traditional news is paying a significant amount of attention to this topic, especially the email scandals, right? So if you look at the email scandal, which is basically 15% of traditional news coverage, and none of the policy topics comes even close to that percentage, right? So this to me is a failing by traditional news that failed to normatively important to cover policy topics to inform the electorate. Instead of doing that, they were focusing on scandals that were a priority for fake news publishers. So with that, now I'll tell the third part of the story, which is we talked about now the kind of nature of these content, how it spread on social media, but social media is not representative, and social media doesn't vote, so it's important to think about what the electorate was thinking as well. So this is where we're going to be tying things to the electorate. So here we need to have we need to define a measure of alignment between the content of these publishers to the content that was uttered by our respondents during their interviews. So to be able to do that, I'm using a method by Monroe et al. Sorry, it seems like I'm missing the citation here, but it's going to come later. Basically using log odds ratio with Dirichlet priors to identify words that are more uniquely associated with traditional versus fake news. So basically we have all this content coming from articles, fake and traditional news. Basically you can simply find the words that are more or less common on those using simple log odds ratio, but those tend to not give great estimates for rare words. So using informed Dirichlet priors basically improves the performance here. So we're using that. And just to give you some examples of words that were sort of more unique to fake versus traditional news, those sort of line up with perhaps what you would expect, right? So for Trump, fake news content has like words like Islam and like liberal, illegal, and leave and establishment and so forth. While for traditional news, there's words that are related to kind of horse race coverage. For Clinton, you have foundation, lawsuit, corrupt, Huma, WikiLeaks, and so forth. And again, for traditional news, there is again still more of a kind of horse race coverage stuff and so forth. So these are kind of examples of kind of unique words. But the point is that for using this method for each word, we can identify a measure of what just sort of quote unquote calling fakeness, right? So it's more aligned with fake news coverage compared to traditional news coverage. So now we can bring that back to our interviews, right? So again, remember that the Gallup was asking people, what have you read, seen, or heard about Clinton and Donald Trump separately? And so for each of these words in these interviews, here I'm going to be showing you the top words in our surveys. So most uttered words in our surveys, and on the y-axis, I'm showing you the weighted fakeness of these words, which is kind of how much more aligned they were with traditional versus fake news. And so let's start with Trump. If you look at Trump, the results look actually somewhat encouraging in that the most common words are more associated with traditional news. And even when you go a little bit further, you're seeing basically words that are sort of neutral and not strongly aligned with fake news. So this is an encouraging finding for sure. And the other encouraging finding is that we're looking at all respondents, Democrats and Republicans separately, and there seems to be no kind of fragmentation in terms of the kinds of things that Democrats and Republicans are remembering about this candidate. If you look at Clinton, however, the results are drastically different, right? So you're seeing, first of all, that there's a significant cut along party lines. So you see this fragmentation very clearly. And you see that, especially for Republicans, the kinds of things that they are remembering are more aligned with fake news compared to traditional news. So this doesn't mean that they were necessarily consuming fake news. This could mean that, again, the kinds of things that fake news tends to cover are perhaps more memorable to especially Republican voters, especially given their emphasis on scandals that might be part of the kind of story here. But we'll kind of compare this to the 2020 to see that it's, even though those kinds of general patterns should persist across 2 years, you might or might not see similarities or differences. But so this is here where we're looking at only top party, and we're only looking at the very common words. We can go one step beyond. Basically, what I'm using is here a random intercept multi-level regression model to identify the relationship between this fakeness of things that people say in interviews and their demographic attributes. So here's the results. So again, through these surveys, we had a number of demographic attributes we could use. So here I'm emphasizing the parts that were significant in my analysis. What we're seeing is that I'm putting an asterisk around younger male Republicans, and to some degree independents. Respondents had a stronger alignment with fake news coverage. And I put an asterisk next to younger because that's one thing it's a small effect, and actually is not robust to the list that you choose. Versus the list, no matter what list we're choosing, basically this gender effect and party effect kind of persists. And also important that the alignment increases over time for Clinton, while the opposite was true for Trump. So the closer you're getting to the election, the more people are saying things that are kind of more aligned with fake news coverage. And that's important because people in most elections are making decisions close to the election, and therefore that's kind of those kinds of things that are more top of mind. So again, we're not looking at in this study, we don't have information as to how people voted. So we're only kind of tying it to what things are top of mind for them. So it's important to keep that in mind, but still we're basically, this data allows us to understand this alignment in relation to so the types of electorates that were kind of processing this information, and we're seeing a strong sort of fragmentation, especially in the way that people kind of perceived and thought about Clinton especially across party lines. So the question that we might ask is, well, Clinton was a woman. She had a long history in politics, and Trump was a kind of a new unknown entity. There are a number of things that changed from 2016 to 2020. Did our findings change as well? So that's the question that we're asking here, which is where I'm going to turn to the 2020 results. And here we're going to be looking at only the alignment question. So this is again coming from the Breakthrough Project. This time weekly interviews. This also led to articles that were published by CNN, where we were sharing interesting patterns we're observing each week. It's a very interesting experience, I must say, because it's you need to be very kind of you're talking to a broad audience as opposed to scholars. So the kinds of things we're producing were like word clouds or plots that have like 4 data points. But we could look at questions about what people are talking about, what are the changes in sentiment before and after RNC and DNC. So those are the kinds of things. But I won't talk about those here. I'll talk about the fact that these data helps us revisit some of these questions. And I'll start with the 2020. Let's see, how am I doing? I don't have time. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes, okay, great, awesome. All right, so then, so we're looking at now 2020, and how do I do this? So here, I just want to caution, first of all, the election just happened, and this is quite fresh data. I was just kind of excited, given that it happened. It's interesting to look back and see what happens. But I want to note that the data that we're using actually goes all the way. The one I'm using goes to September 30th. So there were a lot of interesting spreads of misinformation that happened after that. So these numbers might change when we incorporate all of the numbers. But now I'm relying on the Wayback Machine. It's like a different way of collecting our data to get the homepages of traditional and fake news producers. And this time I'm currently only using the information text that was embedded in the titles as opposed to the entire text. So there are some differences. I just want to caution that, but hopefully the findings are still interesting. So again, all I'm doing right now is repeating the sort of the analyses to provide some comparisons. And again, hopefully the unique words make quite a lot of sense, right? When people are like, when fake news publishers are talking about Trump, well, first of all, fake news publishers love having videos, so that's showing up definitely in the top ones. But they talk about, you know, leftists, riots, CNN. They can't get over Hillary apparently. You know, Hillary, and there's like Hunter Biden. Sorry, not Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden's for Biden. So there's a rioter, meltdown. So those kinds of things they would expect. There's a lot of coronavirus. So coronavirus, they avoid talking about coronavirus. The coronavirus becomes more unique to traditional news coverage. And for Biden, again, like these basement, you know, Tara Reid, Hunter Biden, these kinds of kind of scandals are popping up for Biden. And while more horse race debates, presidential and so forth, are showing up for the traditional news. So I'm just reminding you what we saw for Clinton, like 2016, and showing you what's happening now with 2020. There is too much here, so let's just blind and not look at Democratic candidate for now. Just look at the Trump. And when we look at Trump, it's actually looking quite similar in that you still are seeing that most conversations about, like most things are aligned, at least the popular ones are more aligned with traditional news for Trump. And there's a little bit more divide between the Democrats and Republicans, but not too much. If you look at the Democratic candidates, is when you see a big change in that you're seeing a significant alignment with fake news coverage for Clinton. And luckily, we actually don't see that for Biden this time. And you see, again, a big divide between the across party lines. But even the Republicans are sort of at the borderline zero line, not remembering things that are significantly aligned with fake news. But the divide is still wider across parties for the Democratic candidate as opposed to the Republican candidate. And again, go back to this more sophisticated model that actually has across different demographic attributes incorporated. One thing that is here, the first thing that shows up is actually intercept is something that we usually don't care about, but like the intercept there here is suggesting that the baseline alignment in general with fake news is much lower compared to what was happening in 2016. And gender, perhaps unsurprisingly, no longer a factor. Unlike in Clinton's case, this is not an indicative attribute here. and parties still consistent for the Democratic candidate in terms of how it behaves. But surprisingly, we're not actually seeing that for Trump this time. But what we're seeing for Trump that is a stronger effect is what we see with the age. And I didn't have time to put this into the slides, but we were seeing very strong results, especially for Hunter Biden's story, where most of the people that were talking about Hunter Biden were basically older, especially older Republicans. So that seems like that it did not break to the broader audience, electorate, but was actually kind of highly discussed among this age population. So this effect is a lot stronger than what we had seen in 2016. So just to sort of kind of bring these together, some final notes about comparing 2016 and 2020. We're seeing at the very high level, we're seeing that alignment between the retained information and producers of political misinformation is much weaker in 2020, which is kind of encouraging. But the question is perhaps what changed. First of all, top of mind issue for everyone was coronavirus. So I'll just give you like one kind of screenshot from one of the CNN articles, but this was basically like almost every other week, people were just talking about coronavirus. So when something like that is occupying people's minds, there's just less space for other kinds of information, perhaps fake information to make space. And there's also news that, like again, in 2016, this was all a shock, and both news media and social media did learn something. Perhaps they did not address everything, but they had some responses. So this screenshot of the New York Times homepage is perhaps scarring to a lot of people in the US, where just a short time before the election, the email scandals was homepage and being shared by New York Times, where again, in terms of sharing of scandals, so 15% on email compared to 0.2% on Hunter Biden, for instance, right? So they really kind of clamped down and decided not to share something that was going to be important and perhaps unreliable. And also from the social media, there are a number of things, again, perhaps not doing perfectly, but there are changes in ranking, changes in using of warning flags, banning users, and so forth, sometimes even apply to the President of the United States. And the candidate profiles have changed, and we see that, for instance, especially in the gender effect. One thing that you'd have expected to push things the other way, a very important change, is the amount of misinformation that was being shared by traditionally trusted institutions, for instance, the presidency, where the president was openly sharing misinformation, and you would think that that kind of information is going to be aligned with the way that people are remembering things. So that's an important concern that we saw. Again, that's not the kind of misinformation I looked at, so it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but at least to the degree that if those were aligned with fake news publisher content, we don't clearly see that there. But also want to point to the change in our data, or using only titles. It's a slightly different way of identifying the news articles and so forth. And finally, just want to point out the limitations. There are many. This is a storytelling exercise. It's purely correlational. Most of the analysis was sort of at the word level. Social media is not Twitter. I promise we'll have some stuff with Facebook soon. And there's also quality of analysis depends on the publisher list. We have done some there, but it's important to investigate that further. And finally, we kind of can tie things to what people were saying and remembering, but not how they behaved. So we don't have their behavior and voting information. So really, we don't have these kinds of effects in terms of the fake news production. So with that, that's the end of my story. And thank you.